May 8, 1945. At ports across occupied Europe, German submarine crews received the transmission they never thought they'd hear. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now leader of what remains of the Reich, issues a simple order: cease all operations and surrender to the nearest Allied port. In harbors from Norway to France, on the surface of the Atlantic, and lurking in the depths off distant shores, 470 U-boats fall silent. The wolf packs that nearly strangled Britain, that sent thousands of Allied sailors to the bottom, suddenly have nowhere to go. But this wasn't the end of their story. What came next was a frantic intelligence race, a massive scuttling operation in the North Atlantic, and decades of Cold War service under new flags. The fate of Germany's submarine fleet would shape naval warfare for generations. The numbers were staggering. When Germany surrendered, 156 U-boats remained afloat and operational enough to surrender. But that doesn't tell the full story. Over 200 more had been scuttled by their own commanders in those desperate final weeks, destroyed in port as Soviet and Allied forces closed in. Captains opened sea valves, set demolition charges, and watched their steel predators sink rather than fall into enemy hands. From Kiel to Hamburg, from Norwegian fjords to French harbors, submarines settled into the mud. The U-boats that did surrender presented the Allies with an unprecedented prize and an enormous problem. What do you do with the world's most advanced submarine fleet? Among the surrendered boats were technological marvels that Allied naval intelligence had only recently learned existed. The Type XXI Elektroboot, submarines capable of 17 knots submerged, nearly twice the speed of any Allied submarine. With streamlined hulls and triple the battery capacity of conventional boats, they could operate underwater for days. These weren't diving torpedo boats. They were true submarines designed to spend their entire patrols beneath the surface. British and American naval officers who first inspected these boats in German ports stood in silent awe. One American naval engineer, examining a captured Type 21 in May 1945, understood immediately what he was seeing. This wasn't just advanced. This was a decade ahead of anything in the Allied arsenal. The Royal Navy and U.S. Navy had known about advanced German submarine projects through intelligence reports, but seeing them in person was different. The smooth, whale-like hull eliminated drag. The massive battery banks filled spaces where conventional boats carried diesel fuel. The hydraulic torpedo reloading system could prepare all 6 tubes for firing in under 20 minutes. And the snorkel, that Dutch invention the Germans perfected, allowed diesel engines to run while submerged at periscope depth, recharging batteries without surfacing. But there was something more dangerous hidden in German shipyards. In Hamburg, Bremen, and Danzig, the Red Army discovered incomplete Type 21 hulls. Dozens of them. The Soviets claimed they were simply scrap metal to be broken up. Allied intelligence suspected otherwise. By mid-May 1945, a silent race was underway. British and American technical teams fanned out across occupied Germany, tasked with a critical mission: secure the most advanced U-boats before the Soviets could get their hands on them. In Norwegian ports, in German harbors, and in French submarine pens, Allied officers scrambled to identify which boats held the greatest intelligence value. The Potsdam Agreement in August 1945 attempted to divide the spoils. Each of the big three, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, would receive 10 U-boats for technical evaluation. But the reality was messier. Some boats were too damaged to move. Others disappeared into Soviet hands before the agreement was signed, and a handful managed to escape entirely. The British wanted specific types: advanced coastal boats like the Type 23, with their revolutionary design. Any example of the Walter turbine boats, experimental submarines powered by concentrated hydrogen peroxide that could theoretically achieve speeds of 25 knots submerged. American naval planners prioritized the Type XXI, knowing these represented the future of submarine warfare. Soviet representatives demanded their share, but were deliberately kept away from the most advanced examples. British and American officers feared rightly that Stalin would use captured German technology to build a submarine fleet that could challenge Western naval supremacy. One Type 21 boat, U-2511, was deliberately sailed from Germany to the United States before the Soviets could inspect it. She became the crown jewel of American submarine research. In November 1946, President Harry Truman himself visited U-2513 off the American coast. The submarine dove to 440 feet with the president aboard, demonstrating capabilities that left naval officers speechless. This German boat, built in the dying days of the Third Reich, could dive faster, run quieter, and stay submerged longer than anything the United States Navy possessed. The British commissioned U-30O-17 into the Royal Navy as HMS N-41, conducting exhaustive trials until 1949. French naval officers received U-2326, though she would sink in an accident during trials, taking 17 men with her. But while intelligence teams secured the most valuable boats, 116 U-boats sat gathering rust in 2 British ports. Lisa Halley in Northern Ireland held 30 submarines. Loch Ryan in southwestern Scotland held 86. These weren't the advanced boats. These were conventional Type 7s and Type 9s, the workhorses that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic. And the Allies faced a decision. Scrapping that much steel would take years and cost a fortune. Some U-boats were worth more intact than the metal they'd yield, but letting them sit was impossible. Mines and torpedoes still filled their tubes, diesel fuel contaminated their tanks, and, most importantly, the British government had no intention of allowing these weapons to exist in any form. Churchill himself had called them nasty things to have knocking about in large numbers. The Potsdam Agreement authorized their destruction. By late October 1945, after allocating boats for technical purposes, the Royal Navy received formal orders: sink them all. The operation was codenamed Deadlight. Planning began immediately. The Royal Navy had done nothing like this before. 116 submarines needed to be towed, in the worst sailing season, through some of the most treacherous waters in the North Atlantic to a disposal site over 100 miles northwest of Ireland. The designated scuttling zone was carefully chosen. Water depth exceeded 600 feet, far too deep for salvage operations. The area lay far from shipping lanes, and most critically, it was far enough from shore to prevent any boats from becoming navigational hazards if the scuttling went wrong. Operation Deadlight was scheduled to begin on November 27, 1945, just days before the onset of winter storms. Weather would prove the operation's greatest enemy. Atlantic winter conditions in November and December made towing submarines nearly impossible. These weren't purpose-built tow vessels. They were destroyers, corvettes, and requisitioned Polish warships pressed into service. The U-boats themselves were in varying states of decay. Many hadn't run their engines in months. Fuel tanks were empty. Crews had deliberately damaged systems before surrendering. Some boats had been poorly maintained even before the war ended. The plan called for towing each submarine on a long cable to the disposal site, where naval gunners would sink them with explosive charges or shell fire. Reality proved far more difficult. The first U-boat left Loch Ryan on November 27th. U-2502, A Type 21 boat, survived the tow and was ceremonially sunk by gunfire from British destroyers. But within days, the weather turned savage. Tow lines snapped in heavy seas. Submarines, designed to be stable underwater but terrible surface vessels, wallowed in the swells. Some took on water through open hatches or damaged hulls. On December 8th, U-1735 simply vanished during tow. The cable went slack. When the towing vessel turned back, they found nothing but empty ocean. The submarine had sunk en route, likely overwhelmed by rough seas. This would become a pattern. Of the 116 U-boats designated for Operation Deadlight, 56 never reached the scuttling zone. They sank during tow, victims of the North Atlantic winter. The boats that did reach the disposal site met their end in various ways. Some were sunk by naval gunfire, British destroyers using them for target practice. Others were blown apart by demolition charges placed inside their pressure hulls. A few were bombed by aircraft, and some, their sea valves opened by boarding parties, simply slipped beneath the waves under their own weight. For crews of British warships, there was grim satisfaction in the work. These submarines had terrorized convoy routes for 6 years. They'd sent thousands of sailors to the bottom. Now, in the cold waters northwest of Ireland, they were finally being eliminated. One British destroyer captain, watching a U-boat disappear beneath the waves, remarked that he felt like he was burying ghosts. The operation stretched from November 1945 into February 1946. Each tow was a battle against winter storms. Destroyers returned to port with damaged superstructures, snapped cables, and exhausted crews. At Lisa Halley and Loch Ryan, Royal Navy personnel worked around the clock preparing the next batch of submarines for tow, even as reports came in of boats lost at sea. The final submarine, U-3514, was sunk on February 12, 1946, at 10:04 in the morning. Naval guns and depth charges tore her apart. She was the last of 116 U-boats destroyed in Operation Deadlight. The largest mass scuttling in naval history was complete. But Operation Deadlight wasn't the only fate for German U-boats. Far from the North Atlantic, other submarines were beginning second careers under new flags. The Soviet Union commissioned 4 Type 21 boats into their navy as B-27, B-28, B-29, and B-100. Soviet engineers studied them exhaustively, measuring every dimension, testing every system. These German boats became the foundation for an entire generation of Soviet submarine designs. The Whiskey class, the Zulu class, the Romeo class, all drew heavily from captured Type 21s. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Navy was building submarines based on German wartime technology, churning them out by the dozens. The United States Navy operated 2 Type 21s, U-2513 and U-30-008, conducting years of trials in the Atlantic. American submarine designers learned crucial lessons about hull streamlining, battery capacity, and submerged operations. These studies directly influenced the Guppy program, the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power Initiative that modernized America's World War II submarine fleet. Gato-class and Balau-class boats received streamlined sails, more powerful batteries, and enhanced underwater capabilities, all concepts borrowed from captured U-boats. The British Navy ran similar trials with their captured boats. HMS N-41 operated until 1949, every dive meticulously documented. British engineers studied the hydraulics, the battery systems, the torpedo reload mechanisms. The Porpoise-class submarines of the 1950s combined Type 21 features with British engineering, creating boats capable of 17 knots submerged. The British even experimented with Walter turbine propulsion, commissioning HMS Explorer and HMS Excalibur in the 1950s. These hydrogen peroxide-powered submarines could reach 25 knots underwater, exactly as German engineers had promised. But the fuel proved too dangerous for operational use, and the project was abandoned. Still, the experience pushed British submarine design forward. France commissioned U-2326 into their navy, though she sank in December 1946 during trials. The accident claimed 17 lives, but didn't diminish French interest in German technology. French engineers studied captured boats and used that knowledge to design the Narval-class submarines that served into the 1990s. Norway received 4 U-boats as war reparations. U-995 was commissioned as KNM Kåre, serving the Royal Norwegian Navy until 1965. In 1971, the Germans requested her return, and she became a museum ship at the Lebeau Naval Memorial near Kiel. She remains one of only 4 U-boats preserved anywhere in the world. But perhaps the strangest post-war journeys belong to 2 submarines that refused to surrender at all. On July 10, 1945, 2 months after Germany's capitulation, U-530 surfaced off Mar del Plata, Argentina. The Argentine Navy, stunned, accepted the submarine's surrender. Her crew carried no identification. The ship's log was missing. The deck gun had been jettisoned, and nobody could explain why the journey from Europe had taken over 2 months. The captain, 25-year-old Otto Vermuth, offered no answers. Then on August 17th, a second German submarine appeared, U-977, commanded by 24-year-old Heinz Schäfer, surrendered at the same Argentine port. Schäfer claimed his boat had traveled underwater for 66 consecutive days, surfacing only at Cape Verde for a brief rest. If true, it would be one of the longest submerged voyages in history. The crews were immediately suspected of everything from sinking a Brazilian cruiser to transporting Nazi leaders and gold to South America. American investigators grilled both captains for weeks. The interrogations revealed little except that both men had feared Allied treatment of German submariners and chose Argentina, believing they'd receive better conditions. The United States Navy seized both submarines. U-530 and U-977 were transported to American waters for study. In November 1947, U-530 was used as target practice off Cape Cod. USS Toro fired torpedoes that tore her apart. U-977 met a similar fate in 1946, sunk during naval exercises off Massachusetts. These boats, which had crossed the Atlantic in defiance of surrender orders, ended up as artificial reefs off the American coast. Their exact locations remain known, but unvisited. The depth and exposure make them difficult targets for recreational divers. In the Far East, 4 German U-boats had an even stranger fate. U-181, U-862, U-195, and U-219 were operating in Asian waters when Germany surrendered. The Imperial Japanese Navy, still at war with the Allies, seized them. The submarines were repainted, renumbered, and commissioned into Japanese service. I-501, I-502, I-505, and I-506 continued patrols under the rising sun until Japan's surrender in August 1945. In February 1946, American forces scuttled them at Singapore. These boats, built in Hamburg and Bremen, ended their days in tropical waters half a world away from home. One U-boat achieved what no other managed. She survived to become a war memorial in the nation that built her. U-2540, a Type XXI boat, was raised from Flensburg Harbor where she'd been scuttled. the Soviet Union briefly held her. Then, in 1949, the boat was ceded to East Germany. She was commissioned into the East German Navy, operating under the name of a different vessel. After German reunification, she was restored to her original World War II configuration and placed on display at the German Maritime Museum in Bremerhaven. Now called Wilhelm Bauer, she's the world's only floating example of a Type 21 U-boat. One more U-boat escaped destruction through unusual circumstances. U-505, captured by the United States Navy in June 1944 during a dramatic boarding action off the coast of West Africa, never fell under Operation Deadlight. She'd been captured, not surrendered, and that technicality saved her life. After years in American possession, Rear Admiral Daniel Gallery successfully argued for her preservation. In 1954, she was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Today, U-505 sits in an underground exhibit, the only German U-boat on display in the United States. Over 1 million visitors see her each year, walking through compartments where 59 German sailors once lived and fought. By the early 1950s, nearly every German U-boat from World War II had been eliminated, scrapped, scuttled, or sunk as targets. But their influence persisted. The Soviet Union built hundreds of submarines based on captured German designs. American and British submarines incorporated streamlined hulls and enhanced battery systems learned from Type 21s. French, Norwegian, and Dutch naval engineers studied salvaged boats and applied lessons to their own designs. The U-boat's greatest legacy wasn't military. It was technological. The Type 21 represented the last generation of diesel-electric submarines before nuclear power changed everything. But its design principles, streamlined hulls, massive battery capacity, snorkel operations, remained relevant into the 21st century. Modern conventional submarines, from German Type 212 boats to Japanese Soryu-class vessels, are direct descendants of those revolutionary U-boats built in the closing months of World War II. In recent decades, marine archaeologists have begun locating the wrecks from Operation Deadlight. Between 2001 and 2003, nautical archaeologist Innes McCartney discovered and surveyed 14 U-boats in the designated scuttling zone northwest of Ireland. Among them was U-2506, the advanced Type 21 boat once commanded by a German naval officer. The wreck lies in deep water, largely intact, a steel time capsule from 1946. Another surveyed wreck, U-155, had achieved success during the war before meeting her end in Operation Deadlight. These wrecks have gained unexpected value. U-boats were built before the atomic age, meaning their steel isn't contaminated by background radiation from nuclear testing. This low background steel is valuable for certain scientific instruments that require radiation-free materials. Several salvage companies have applied for permits to raise Operation Deadlight wrecks, but objections from Russia, the United States, and Britain have prevented any recovery operations. The submarines remain where the Royal Navy sent them. 600 feet down in the cold North Atlantic, a handful of German U-boats served in surprising places for decades after the war. Spain-operated U-573, renamed S-01 until 1970. The submarine had been interned in Spain since 1943, and after the war, the Spanish Navy simply kept her. She even appeared in films portraying U-47 in a German movie production. Her final decommissioning in 1970 marked the end of German U-boat operations, 25 years after Germany's surrender. Paraguay received Sherman tanks that served until 2018, but no U-boats made it quite that far. Still, by 1970, a German submarine built during World War II was still in active naval service. It's a testament to the quality of German engineering and the desperation of smaller navies seeking any combat capability they could acquire. The last traces of Germany's U-boat force finally disappeared in the 1990s. Museum ships were the only survivors. 4 U-boats remain on public display today. U-505 in Chicago, U-995 at Lebow, Germany, U-2540, the Wilhelm Bauer, in Bremerhaven, and sections of U-534, recovered from the seabed, displayed in Liverpool, England. These 4 boats represent over 1,000 U-boats built during World War II. The vast majority were eliminated during the war, struck down by depth charges, aircraft, and Allied destroyers. Of those that survived to surrender, most were destroyed in Operation Deadlight or used as target practice. A select few served under new flags, advancing Cold War submarine technology, and a tiny number were preserved as monuments and museums. What happened to Germany's U-boats after World War II was, in many ways, more remarkable than their wartime service. These submarines shaped Cold War naval strategy. Soviet, American, British, and French submarines all borrowed from captured German designs. The streamlined hull forms, the battery technology, the operational concepts, all came from studying those steel cylinders pulled from German harbors in 1945. Today, when a modern conventional submarine glides silently through the deep on battery power, its design owes a debt to engineers working in wartime Germany. When naval architects calculate battery capacity and hull resistance, they're solving problems first tackled for the Type XXI. The U-boats that terrorized the Atlantic for 6 years ended up shaping submarine design for generations. And in the cold waters northwest of Ireland, 116 steel hulls rest on the seabed. They've been there for nearly 80 years now, slowly corroding, gradually becoming part of the ocean floor. They're the largest submarine graveyard in the world, a monument to the end of Germany's naval power and the beginning of the Cold War beneath the waves. The wolf packs are gone, but their legacy endures in every submarine that slides beneath the surface today. If you found this deep dive into naval history compelling, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the greatest conflict in human history. The battles may have ended, but their echoes never truly fade.